They said he would freeze. They said no one could last more than a week out there with the hum of a generator or the thin orange glow of propane heat. They said the Alaskan cold does not forgive, and that even the most stubborn man will in the end bow to the frost. But they did not know him. They did not know what strength a man can find when he stops fearing the cold, begins to listen to it. Out there, in the deep silence of winter, where the sky itself seems to creak from the weight of ice, he found something warmer than any fire, the simple warmth of understanding the land. The mountain was his teacher long before it became his home. He learned the rhythm of snow, how it falls in layers that breathe like the rings of a tree, how sound travels differently when the air is sharp, dry, how even smallest mistake, a gap in the wall of a shelter, a careless footprint in soft snow could cost you the night. But he also learned that the mountain is not cruel. It is patient. It gives exactly what you are ready to receive, no more, no less. And in that balance, he found peace. He had no need to escape or prove anything. He was simply there, living one quiet day after another, letting the land shape him the same way water stone. When he built his snow shelter, it was not an act of desperation, but one of respect. He knew the way to stay warm in a place like to fight the cold, but to understand. Snow, to most people, is the symbol of death, stillness. But to him, it was the same snow that could bury a cabin, also held the protect. He chose his spot carefully, near a curve in the valley where the wind curled around like a whispering hand. With a small shovel and the patience of someone who knows time means nothing out there, began to dig. Each movement had rhythm. Each pause had purpose. He was not racing daylight because he had learned long ago that rushing against the mountain only makes it colder. When the hollow of his shelter began to take shape, he felt the first quiet thrill of belonging. The walls grew thick, pressing close, reflecting his breath until the air inside softened. Snow, for all its coldness, has a secret. It traps warmth better than most people would believe. He shaped the walls in gentle curves, letting the ceiling rise just enough to keep the air circulating. Then he carved a sleeping ledge from the inner wall and blocked the entrance with a tight snow door. Inside, it was dim and muffled, a world of faint blue light and breathing silence. Outside, the wind screamed and threw itself across the valley. Within that fragile dome, he could take off his gloves and feel his hands again. The snow shelter stayed 40 degrees warmer than the world outside. People would never believe it, he thought. They would imagine he had some trick, some secret heater hidden beneath the floor. But there was nothing more than his breath, his body, and the way snow itself knew how to hold life. It was not. It was simply the earth doing what it had always done, offering balance to those who know how to listen. He spent many nights in that shelter, the kind of nights the stars too sharp to be real. Sometimes he would hear the slow settling of snow, the faint shifting. In those sounds, he heard stories older than words, stories of pressure, patience, and in that he began to remember what it means to truly live. The world he had left behind, with its noise and clocks, endless motion, seemed like a distant dream. Out here, there was only breath, heat, and silence. He would wake each morning to a thin stripe of pale light filtering through the snow door. The cold would kiss his face, gentle, commanding, reminding him to move, to live. He would crawl out, stretch his limbs, and look across the valley, the dark pine bowing under burden. The mountains stretched beyond them, white and unbroken, their peaks glowing pink in the weak morning sun. He would take a deep breath, feel the frost fill his chest, smile. The world was clean, unspoiled, untouched by anything that did not belong. And for the first time, he felt like he did belong. He remembered the voices that once told him he would freeze. Solitude would eat him alive, that the cold would break his mind, broke his. But they never understood that there are different kinds of warmth in this world. Some come from fire, some from people, from his shelter, built of snow and silence, is proof of that. inside it, he was not a man hiding from cold. He was a man resting within it, trusting it, becoming part of its rhythm. When the night deepened, the temperature dropped below anything most people could imagine, he would lie still and listen. The wind might roar across the ridges, snow might swirl and bury his trail, but inside the shelter there was stillness. The walls glowed faintly with moonlight filtering through, and he could hear the soft echo of his own breath. In that sound, he found a strange kind of companionship. It was as if the mountain breathed with him, as if the world itself acknowledged his small, persistent. The longer he stayed, the more he understood that survival was not about conquering the wild, but about trusting it enough to let it hold you. He had learned to make tea from melted snow, to cook simple meals on a small stove fueled by the twigs he gathered before the storm. He would sit for hours watching the steam rise in the still air, his thoughts moving slowly like the shadows drift across snowfields. The mountain had a way of quieting the mind, stripping it of all noise until only truth remained. And that truth was simple. Everything we need has already been given, if only we have the courage to. Sometimes, when the sky cleared after a storm, he would step out and look up. The stars would blaze like ice crystals, so bright they made the darkness glow. The cold would bite at his face, but he didn't mind. He would walk a little distance from the shelter, just far enough to see it from the outside, a small rounded mound of snow in the endless white. To anyone else, it would look fragile, temporary, almost nothing at all. But he knew that within those walls was warmth enough to sleep, think, dream, and live. It was a small miracle, made not of technology or strength, but of understanding. He never called it a snow cave or an igloo or a shelter. To him, it was simply home. And in that home, surrounded by the weight of winter, he found a freedom few ever know. There was no fear left, no loneliness that could reach him, because the mountain had already. He had earned his place not by force, by humility. Out there, in that stillness, he learned that nature does not reward the loud, proud, quiet who listen. And perhaps that is the secret few ever understand, that warmth is not always about heat, and survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about surrender, about letting go of everything you thought you needed until only what truly matters remains. In that snow shelter, 40 degrees warmer than the frozen world outside, he found that kind of warmth, not just in temperature, spirit. He wondered sometimes what people would think they saw him. Would they still call him a hermit? Would they still think he was lost, running from something? Maybe, but he knew the truth. He was not hiding. He was home. The mountain was his companion, the snow his protection, the silence his teacher. Every gust of wind, every flake of falling snow spoke to him in a language beyond words, and in that language he found peace, deeper than any he had known among people. There is something beautiful about knowing the world can still find, that even in the coldest place, life finds a keep warm, that a man, alone with his breath and his thoughts, can carve a small circle of comfort out of the endless winter and call it home. That is what he wanted others, that the mountain is not an and solid punishment. They are both gifts, waiting for those who have the patience to understand them. He had no need for applause, no desire for recognition. The warmth of his shelter was enough. It was proof that there is always a way to live with not a. And as the long night stretched on, he smiled in the darkness, knowing that he had found something far greater than survival. He had found belonging, and maybe, story, you too feel a little of that warmth, quiet reminder that even in coldest, something within us always knows living. Tell me, where are you listening from? Before the mountain, there was noise, the kind that fills your head even when you think you're alone. Engines, screens, voices that overlap, deadlines that chase you through dreams. He had lived in that world once, in a small apartment with too many lights and too little darkness. The city had its rhythm, fast, bright, hungry, and for a time he thought that rhythm was life. He worked, he earned, smiled, and at night he would fall asleep to the sound of traffic, convincing him that those sounds were proof he was part of something larger. But deep down, he always knew it was hollow. There is a silence that calls to some men from birth, a silence that lives underneath all the noise, waiting. He had heard it faintly all his life, like a memory he couldn't place. His father had been a quiet man, too, a fisherman from the old coast, who taught him early that the sea does not listen to excuses. They would go out before dawn, the boat creaking under their weight, salt stinging their faces, and for hours they would not. His father would simply look at the horizon and nod once in approval, as if silence itself the lesson. He learned then that there is honesty in nature that men rarely show each other, that when you are cold, wet, and small, before the vastness of it all, there is no room left for pretending. That memory stayed with him long after his father's hands grew too frail to tie a knot, long after the sea became just a story he told himself when the city lights grew unbearable. When his father passed, he didn't cry, not because he didn't love him, but because some losses are too deep for tears. They settle into the body like a stone in still water. You don't notice them every day, but they change the way everything moves inside. He kept working, kept pretending, but the stone grew heavier. He would find himself staring out of his office window at the gray skyline, imagining mountains where there were only buildings, snow was only. He would close his eye and almost hear the sound of the wind's ice, the steady rhythm of boots, frozen ground. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like longing, a deep remembering of something he hadn't yet lived. He had people around him then, colleagues, neighbors, even someone who loved him once. But love in the city can be like smoke, beautiful, but impossible to hold. They tried to build something together, but he always felt like he was looking past, toward a distance she couldn't see. She wanted light and warmth and conversation. He wanted stillness. When she left, she told him he was too quiet, too calm, like he had already disappeared somewhere she couldn't follow. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had begun to vanish even before he packed his first bag. The decision to leave came slowly, like snow piling on a roof. One day, he realized it was already done. He sold most of what he owned, which he discovered was far more than he ever needed, and kept only what could fit in a few packs. He bought maps, read journals from old explorers, and learned the forgotten skills of men who lived by their hand. But even as he prepared, he knew that no amount of gear or planning would truly ready him. The wilderness is not a place you master. It is a place that humbles you, and that was what he wanted most. To be humbled again, to stand before something vast, silent, and remember what it meant to be small. He left without ceremony. One morning, he simply walked out of the city, boarded a train heading north, and never looked back. The further the tracks carried him, the quieter he became. When the rails ended, he took a bush plane. When the plane could go no further, he walked. Each step took him deeper into the kind of silence he had been missing all his life. At first, it frightened him, not because of the loneliness, but because of what he began to hear inside himself once all the noise was gone. The mind, when faced with stillness, speaks loud. It brings up every regret, every question, every piece of unfinished life. But he did not turn away. He listened, even when it hurt, and with time, the noise inside him softened, the same way a stream calms after snow melt. In the first winter, he nearly gave up, not because of hunger or cold, but because of memory. The mind can be cruel when it has too much time to wander. He would sit by his small fire and see faces in the smoke, people he had left, choices he could not undo. But even that pain began to change. The mountain does not erase your past. It reshapes it. What once felt heavy becomes fuel. What once hurt becomes quiet. He began to understand that leaving was not an escape from people, but a return to something older, something purer. The mountain became a mirror, and in its reflection he saw who he really was, a man stripped of all that was unnecessary, standing alone but complete. He learned to read the sky like a map. The color of the clouds told him how long he had before snow returned. The flight of birds showed him where shelter might be. He started keeping small notes on scraps of paper, not to share, but to remember the rhythm of each day. He would write things like, "The snow fell softer tonight," or "The fox passed close, did not fear me." These were not records for anyone else. They were reminders that he was still part of the story of the land, and slowly his old life faded like smoke in wind. He no longer thought about the noise of the city, the hum of electricity, or the endless conversation that went nowhere. The mountain gave him a different kind of conversation, one made of silence, of wind, slow change. There was one evening, early in his second year, when the northern lights spilled across the sky like liquid fire. He had been walking back from the tree line after collecting fallen branches when he saw them dancing above him in waves green and gold. For a long time he just stood there, his breath rising like mist, feeling something shift deep inside. It was not awe, not in the way tourists feel when they see beauty from a It was recognition, as if the light was not outside him but within. That night, as he watched the sky burn quietly over the frozen world, he realized he had finally stopped searching. The mountain was not a destination. It was the answer he had been chasing all along. In those moments, he understood why he had to leave. The world he came from measures life in noise, in speed, in accumulation. But the mountain measures life stillness, in breath, in endurance. There is no applause here, no competition, no one to tell you who you should be, only the slow, endless rhythm of the earth turning under snow. And in that rhythm he found freedom. He would sometimes think of those he left behind, not with regret, but with gratitude. They had given him reasons to seek what he now had. Every disappointment, every misunderstanding, every moment of ache, they were all steps that led him here. He would whisper their names into the wind sometimes, not as farewells, but as acknowledgments. They were part of his story, as surely as the frost and the stars. In time, he began to forget the sound of engines, the chatter of crowded rooms, the thin, artificial warmth of radiators. Instead, he came to love the deep hum of wind against the trees, the way snow muffled the world until even his heartbeat sounded sacred. He would lie awake some nights, listening to that silence, and think, this is what life was meant to be. Not loud, not complicated, but real. It took him years to build his home deep enough in the wilderness that even planes could not reach him easily. He chose a valley where the sun lingered a little longer in winter. Streams ran clear even beneath ice. He built with patience, stone, wood, snow. His hands grew rough again, his shoulders strong, his movement. Everything he did had purpose. There was no wasted motion, no rush. Each day he worked, gathered, repaired, rested, and in that repetition he found the rhythm his heart had always longed for. By the time people heard about him, the so-called Alaskan Hermit, he had already lived many years in that quiet peace. The stories they told were full of exaggeration, that he had gone mad, that he spoke to animals, that he never saw another soul. But the truth was simpler and more beautiful. He was not escaping humanity. He was rediscovering it in its oldest form, the bond between man and earth, breath and air, fire and snow. Out there, far from the world, he found that survival was not the absence of comfort, the presence of meaning. Every meal cooked, every shelter built, every storm endured carried a quiet joy. He was not surviving, he was living. And if you asked him now why he left, he would not speak of pain or loss. He would simply smile and say, some men are born with mountains inside them, and the only way to live in peace is to go where those mountains stand tall enough to meet the ones in your heart. If you feel that pull too, whisper, stillness calling through the noise. Maybe it's time you listen. And if this story has found you, maybe it's because some part of you already knows that silence is not emptiness. It's the beginning of truth. And if you'd like to keep walking through this journey with me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story. The days had no names up there, and that was part of their beauty. He no longer cared for calendars or clocks. The mountain marked time in subtler ways, in the tilt of light across the ridge, the thickness of the frost at dawn, the call of ravens that passed only at certain hours. There was no need to count days when every moment felt complete. The silence was not empty as people imagined, vast, full of presence. It was the sound of snow shifting under its own weight, the slow breathing of trees beneath ice, the hum that lives in your ears when the wind has gone too still. At first, he would speak to himself out of habit, small mutterings while working or walking, but slowly even that faded. Words became unnecessary. The silence said more than language ever could. He had a small rhythm to his days. Mornings were for motion. He would rise before the light touched the peaks and step outside, his breath trailing behind like smoke. The air would bite his lungs. It made him feel alive. He would walk to check his trap, not out of greed, but gratitude. Every animal was treated with respect, every pelt used, every bit of meat cooked carefully, nothing wasted. The mountain gives only to those who take. He believed that deeply. Sometimes he would find no sign of life at all, and he would smile, as if the land had decided that day to keep its gifts. That was fine too. Hunger, like cold, had its lesson. He spent much of his time tending to small things, the way the stovepipe leaned, the cracks his boots, the steady rhythm of his axe. There was peace, felicity. Each task was its own world. When you live in silence, you begin to notice details that city life erases. The way snowflakes differ from each, how the smell of smoke changes with the type of wood, how your body tells you when weather is shifting before the sky does. He became fluent in those signs. He knew by the weight of air, storm was coming, by the movement of breath, if the temperature would fall below safe limit. Knowledge like doesn't come from book. It comes from listening, truly listening with your whole being. Nights were long in the winter. Sometimes the sun would rise only for a few hours, a pale smear of light across the horizon before the darkness returned. But even in that darkness, life continued quietly. He would sit by the small fire, wrapped in furs, writing short notes in a journal made from stitched hides and salvaged paper. The entries were never long, just lines like, "The moon is brighter on the snow tonight," or "The fox's tracks lead north." Over time, those notes became more than a record. They were his dialogue with the silence. Each line was a way of saying, "I am still here. I am still listening." Sometimes he would talk to the fire, not with word, with thought. He believed that flames had memory, that every spark carried the breath of something that once lived, a branch, a leaf, a piece of sun captured long ago. When he fed the fire, he felt like he was returning something to the world that had given him everything. And as he watched it burn, he would think about the strange way warmth and destruction share the same light. Everything in nature had that balance, beauty and danger, creation and loss, life and stillness. To live there, he had to accept all of it as one truth. The silence was a teacher that spoke through patience. It taught him that nothing is wasted if you know how to see it. Even the dead trees standing brittle on the ridge had purpose. They held snow that would melt into the streams, feeding the valley come spring. Even loneliness had a shape. It pushed him inward, where the quiet parts of himself waited to be heard. At first, that inner quiet frightened him. We spend so much of life running from our own thoughts that facing them feels like facing the wild itself. But once he did, he found they were not his enemy. They were simply echoes of a man trying to understand where he belonged. When storms came, the world would disappear in white. The wind would roar so loud it shook the shelter, snow swirling so thick It erased all trace of direction. In those moments, survival became simple. Stay warm, stay calm, breathe. He would sit cross-legged, his back to curved wall of snow, and listen. Storm howl, living thing. Some nights it went on for hours, maybe days. Yet, even then, he did not fear. He knew the storm was part of the mountain's language, a test and a blessing at once. When it finally passed, he would crawl out into a world transformed. The drifts would have swallowed his tracks, reshaped the hills, carved new paths through the trees, and as stood there under a clean wind, he would feel like the world had been reborn. But there were moments of strange beauty. One else, a frozen mist that hung over the stream at dawn, glowing gold when the sun touched. The sound of a distant avalanche echoing like thunder across miles of quiet. The way the air shimmered with ice crystals when he exhaled into the first. He often thought that if people could see what, they might understand why he chose life. But he also knew some things cannot, they have to be lived. Silence is not something you can describe. It must be entered, the way you step into cold water and let it surround you completely. He began to see himself not as separate from the mountain, but as part of its breathing. He realized that his life was not about conquering isolation, but becoming fluent in it. In the city, solitude is something people fear. They fill it with distraction, with noise, with the company of others. But here, solitude was alive. It had weight, texture, a presence you could almost touch. It sharpened his senses until he could feel the pulse of the land beneath his feet. Every gust of wind felt personal. Every silence had a shape. Every sound a meaning. The animal became his neighbor, not pets, not symbols, just other beings sharing the same world. The ravens were the first to trust him, landing near his shelter, their black eyes bright with curiosity. Then came the fox, always cautious but unafraid. Once deep in the stillness of early spring, he woke to find a caribou standing near his doorway, steam rising its breath. They looked at each other for a long time, two lives joined by nothing but quiet understanding. That was how he preferred it, connection without ownership, respect, intrusion. He often thought about how different that was from the life he had led. In the world of men, we take endlessly from each other, from the earth, from time itself. But the mountain does not allow taking without balance. For every tree you cut, you must plant thought. For every animal you hunt, you must give thanks. For every moment of comfort, you must endure its equal in hardship. That rhythm, that fairness, was what made life there honest. When summer finally returned, bringing long days, softer winds, the silence changed, never the streams sang louder, the air carried the scent of pine and thawed earth. He would walk barefoot through moss, feel the pulse of life's skin. The same valleys that had seemed lifeless in winter pulsed with motion. Insects, birds, the rustle of new leaves. Yet even in that vibrant season, the quiet remained deeper now, richer. Silence was no longer absent. Harmony. He sometimes wondered if he had become invisible to the world. Seasons turned, years slipped by, and his name faded from any memory beyond the valley. He didn't mind. The mountain knew him. The sky knew him. That was enough. His worth was not in being seen, but in being of something endless. He often thought that people spend too much of their lives trying to leave a mark, as if the world needs proof that they existed. But up here, he learned that the greatest peace comes not from marking the earth, but from moving without leaving. There was no loneliness, only belonging. When he sat outside at night, watching the slow arc of the stars, he could feel the same stillness in his own breath. The mountain had taught him to live without wanting, to exist without asking for more. Every day was enough, every moment whole, and that, he thought, was the true meaning of freedom. Not escape, not detachment, but peace, the kind that comes when you no longer feel the need to be anywhere else. And maybe, listening to this now, You can feel a little of that quiet too, the kind that softens your thoughts, steadies your heart. Because silence, when you finally stop running from it, is not your enemy. It's the doorway back to yourself. It was in the fifth winter that the mountain truly tested him. By then, he had grown comfortable with the patterns of solitude. His body had become lean and strong, his hands thick with calluses, his senses sharpened to every sound. He had learned to predict storms by the taste of the air, to find water beneath ice, to catch fish through cracks when the rivers froze. He no longer feared the cold nor the silence. But comfort, even in the wild, is a dangerous thing. The mountain never lets a man believe he's mastered it. It waits, patient as always, and when it sees pride flicker, even for a moment, it reminds him that humility is not optional here. It is survival. The winter came early that year, heavier than any he had known before. The sky turned gray and stayed that way week after week. The sun was a pale ghost that barely lifted above the ridges. Snow fell endlessly, not in storms, but in quiet persistence, each flake adding weight until the world seemed buried in silence. At first, he welcomed it. The deeper the snow, the quieter the world became, and that quiet had always been his ally. But as the weeks passed, he began to sense something different in the air. Stillness that was too complete, a silence that pressed down instead of opening out. His supplies were low but manageable. He had planned carefully, as always. Yet one morning he woke to find that the stream he relied on for water had frozen solid, thicker than he had ever seen. He hacked at it with his axe until the blade chipped. The ice did not yield. The cold had gone too deep, deeper than even his experience accounted for. That night, the temperature dropped below anything his thermometer could measure. The air itself seemed to bite, as if the cold had teeth. When he exhaled, the vapor didn't drift. It hung still in front of him, suspended in the frozen air. Even his shelter, built from snow and patience, began to groan under the weight of frost. He had never heard it make that sound before. It wasn't danger yet, but it was warning. He knew the mountain was speaking to him, testing his understanding. The lesson was clear. No man, however seasoned, can ever claim control over nature. You live with it, not above it. He spent that night awake, listening to the strange creaks and distant cracks echoed through the valley. Each one sounded like the voice of the land shifting. The wind had gone completely still, an omen he did not like. In the wilderness, silence can mean peace, but it can also mean the breath before violence. The storm came without warning, not a blizzard of snow, but a storm of wind, fierce, relentless, like a living thing tearing at the world. It came down from the peaks, roaring through the trees, lifting snow into the air until the sky and ground became one. The sound was deafening, a low, continuous shook even the strongest trunks. Inside his shelter, he felt the force of it pressing, as if invisible hands were trying to crush the walls. He reinforced the inner side with packed snow and blocks of ice, knowing that resistance was futile but necessary. For 2 days, he did not sleep. He sat wrapped in furs, his small lamp flickering, his breath visible in the dim light. He could feel the mountain moving out, sculpting new forms in the storm's chaos. When the wind finally ceased, the silence was absolute. He crawled out and found the landscape unrecognizable. The valley had been reshaped. Trees that had stood for decades snapped and buried. The mouth of the stream was gone, covered by a new ridge of snow and ice. His traps were lost, his path erased, even the shelter's entrance buried beneath several feet of. He dug his way out slowly, his body aching, his fingers raw. And when he finally stood in the open, he felt small again, humbled in the way only the mountain could make him feel. But it was then, in that devastation, that he found something he had never expected, a sign of life. Near the edge of a collapsed ridge, he saw movement, faint but certain. At first, he thought it was his eyes deceiving him in the brightness, but when he knelt closer, he saw a shape, small, trembling, half buried in the snow. A young wolf, no more than a few months old, its fur crusted with ice, one paw twisted under its body. It had likely been separated from its pack during the storm, stranded and too weak to move. The animal's eyes were wild, but not afraid, meeting his strange recognition, as if both understood the other's struggle. He hesitated. In nature, every choice carries weight. To intervene is to change the rhythm. To walk away is to let the rhythm stay whole. But he had learned long ago that survival is not only about strength, it is about compassion too. He lifted the small creature gently, wrapping it in his coat. Its body was cold, but there was still breath. He carried it back to his shelter, his footprints the only marks in the new snow. Inside, he laid it near the fire, slowly warming it with his hand, melting snow for water to drip between its lips. It did not resist. Its breathing was shallow, steady. For the first time in many years, he felt something stir within him, not loneliness, but connection, the kind that doesn't come from words or need, but from the simple truth two lives, however different, had met in the same fight for warmth. Over the next days, he tended to the wolf. He shared what little food he had, softening dried meat and boiling water. He cleaned its wound, spoke soft, calm tremors. The animal began to trust him slowly, its eyes following his movements, its breathing syncing with the rhythm of the shelter's quiet. He named it nothing. Out there, names were unnecessary. What mattered was present, and soon the small creature began to stand again, testing its weight, limping at first, then moving with strength. When it finally it paused, looked back at him, not a pet to its master, but as one being acknowledging another. Then it disappeared into the wild. He thought that would be the end of it, but in the days that followed, he would see it again, a shadow moving at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. The wolf had not left completely. It had simply returned to its nature, keeping its distance, but never truly gone. And in that silence, he discovered something deeper than the mountain had given him a mirror, and the reflection was alive. The discovery was not just the wolf. It was what the wolf awakened in him. He realized that even in the most complete solitude, life seeks connection. The land itself is a web of quiet exchanges, warmth traded for breath, strength balanced by gentleness. His act of compassion had not broken the rhythm. It had deepened it. The mountain tested his understanding and found him ready. He understood now that to live alone does not mean to live without love. It means to love differently, quietly, fiercely, without possession. After that winter, he saw the world around him with new eyes. The mountain no longer felt like something he lived upon, but something he lived within. He noticed how the snow moved differently across the valley, how certain places held echoes of his own steps and those of the wolf. He began to see patterns, trails that reappeared each season, marks of the same creatures surviving year after year. The wilderness was not chaos, it was memory. Every gust of wind, every drift of snow, every returning animal was part of a conversation older than mankind. Sometimes he would catch sight of the wolf again, stronger now, larger, its coat shining under the sun. It never approached too close, but it never stayed far. They shared the same space in mutual understanding. When he hunted, he left part of his catch near the tree line, and by morning the offering would be gone. It was a quiet exchange, a pact without words. And though he never touched the animal again, he knew that it was his equal, a part of his world as vital as the cold or the fire. That spring, when the thaw finally came and the streams broke free, he stood at the edge of the valley and listened to the rush of melting ice. The world was alive again. So was he. The challenge of that winter had changed him. It had stripped him of every illusion of control, then returned him to himself through compassion. He had faced the mountain and survived, but more importantly, he had learned that survival is not the same as living. Living means feeling, even when it hurts, even when it risks loss. He often thought of that storm afterward, of the silence that followed, and of the small heartbeat he had carried against it. That memory stayed with him longer than any hardship. It reminded him that even the hardest winters bring something new, a test, a gift, a chance to rediscover the heart under the frost. And maybe that is the lesson the mountain gives to those who listen long enough. That strength is not in resisting the world, but in opening yourself to it fully, even when it cuts, even when it freezes. Because warmth, real warmth, is born not from fire, but from connection. If you are still here listening to this story, maybe you understand a little of what he found. That peace is not the absence of challenge, but the acceptance of. And if you want to keep walking through this journey to see where that quiet road leads next, I invite you to stay, to subscribe, and to keep. The mountain still has more to tell. With time, the silence became his philosophy. It was no longer a condition of his life, but the core of it. A teacher more patient than any human mind could imagine. He began to think often about the world he had left, not with bitterness or longing, but with quiet curiosity, as if examining the memory of a dream. From the distance of his mountain, he could see how restless the world below had become. Men and women running from one place to another, always reaching for something that seemed to move faster than they could. It was strange to think that once he had been part of that rhythm in its current, believing movement itself was meaning. Now he knew that stillness could be just, that sometimes the truest journey is the one that takes you nowhere but deeper within. He often reflected on how strange it is that humans have built lives so distant from the earth that gave them everything. They chase comfort until it traps them, and when they finally rest, they feel uneasy. Silence no longer feels. He used to be like that too. The first winters in the wild were difficult, not because of hunger or cold, because of the absence of noise. The mind, unaccustomed to quiet, begins to invent its own. But once that noise fades, once you learn to listen without demand, you begin to hear something older than thought, the heartbeat of the world itself. He thought often heartbeat. It was in the river under ice, in the wind that crossed the ridges, in the soft pads of animals moving through snow. It reminded him that life everywhere follows the same rhythm: expansion and retreat, growth and decay, light and dark. People in the cities live surrounded by walls and wires and forget this balance. They try to keep summer forever, light forever, warmth forever. But the mountain knows that balance is not something to resist. It is the very shape of existence. He had learned to live with the seasons, to embrace the deep sleep of winter, the fierce renewal of spring. Each cycle is a lesson in acceptance, a reminder nothing needs to last to have meaning. Sometimes he would stand on a high ridge and watch clouds drift through the valley below, and he would think about how small human struggles really are. Down there, people fight for moments, possessions, victories that vanish like mist. Up here, time moves differently. It does not rush, it breathes. The mountain does not care who you were before or what you might become. It asks only that you be present, that you live honestly within its silence. In that truth, he found freedom. He came to understand that the mountain had never been his. It had been his mirror. Every hardship it gave him reflected something inside himself that needed to be. The cold showed him patience. The hunger taught him gratitude. The storms reminded him that strength is nothing without humility. Even the solitude was a gift, stripping away the noise of ego until all that remained truly mattered. He no longer needed to prove anything, not to the world, not to himself. His life had become a quiet dialogue between breath and wind, between body and earth. There were evenings when he would sit outside as the sun disappeared behind and the shadows stretched long across the snow. The colors would shift from gold to pink to blue, gray, and he would feel the light fade not as loss but as depletion. he would think about fear ending, fight against the natural rhythm of change. But he had learned that endings are not the opposite of beginnings. Same breath, drawn in and released again. Everything that ends feeds what begins. That was how he lived now, without clinging, without grasping. He sometimes thought about the younger version of himself, the man who once believed life was a race to be won. He wondered what that man would think if he could see him now, standing in the snow with frost on his beard, calm in his heart. Perhaps that younger self would call him mad, or deep down, he would understand that this was chasing all along, ambition, noise. The older he became, the more he realized the greatest distance a man can travel is not across land or ocean, but from the person he once was to the one he finally understands. He had begun to see beauty everywhere, not the beauty of perfection, the beauty, truth. The cracks in the ice, the scars on old trees, the wrinkles of his own hands, they were all signs of life honestly lived. The world below taught people to hide those marks, to polish and pretend. But here, marks were proof of endurance, of having faced the elements and remained. He wore his age like the mountain wore its ridges, proudly, without apology. When he found old tools buried in the snow, perhaps left by trappers long before him, he would hold them gently, thinking about the hands that once used them. Each item was a story, a trace of another life that had sought the same understanding. He realized then that even solitude connects us, not through presence, but through continuity. Every man who had ever lived close to the earth had touched the same truth, that we belong to it, not it to us. He felt kinship with people he would never meet, bound by the simple act of listening to the same wind. As the years passed, his reflections grew softer. He no longer judged the world he left behind. He simply observed it from afar, like watching a river you once swam in flow away. He knew that not everyone was meant for this kind of silence. Some hearts need noise to feel alive. But he wished quietly that more people could touch the stillness just once, even for a moment, to feel how it steadies the soul. He imagined if the world could fall silent for a single day, no machines, no traffic, no endless chatter, perhaps people would finally hear themselves again. He thought about the idea of progress, strange hunger that drives men to build higher, faster, louder. Progress is not wrong, he thought, but it is incomplete. It builds outward and forgets to build inward. The mountain had taught him that real progress happens in silence, in patience, in the small, invisible work of understanding oneself. No technology, no invention, no system could replace that. He smiled often at the thought that while the world rushed to connect through wires and screens, he had found his deepest connection through quiet breath and frozen ground. He often reflected on the word freedom. People used it as if it were something you could own or lose, as if it depended on laws, borders. But he knew now that freedom has nothing to do with where you are. It is how deeply you accept where you are. Freedom is not running from, it is standing still within it and feeling no fear. Out here, surrounded by ice and sky, he was freer than he had ever been, not because he had escaped the world, but because he no longer needed to fight it. Sometimes he wondered if others would ever understand what he had found. He doubted it, and that was fine. Truth does not need an audience, but he hoped that someday someone might stumble upon his small shelter, see the worn tools, the ashes of old fires, the faint carvings on the wooden walls, and feel a spark of recognition. Maybe they would understand that a man had lived here, not as a hermit, as a listener, one who traded comfort for clarity, noise for meaning. And maybe, just maybe, they would leave in silence, carrying a little of that stillness back to the world below. He had no regret. The life he left was not wrong. It was simply unfinished. The mountain completed him in ways he never could have imagined. It taught him that peace, the nation, a daily practice, something you build with every breath, every act of patience, every acceptance of what is. Even hardship became part of that peace, because It reminded him that nothing worth understanding comes easily. There were moments when he felt tears on his face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of it all. The quiet, the endurance, the endless exchange between man and earth. He had come here seeking solitude, but what he found was unity. Everything was connected: the cold, the warmth, the hunger, the satisfaction. He was not, he was part of everything. And as he sat there in the fading light, the mountain breathing around him, he thought that perhaps this was what humanity had forgotten, that to live well is not to own or to conquer, but to belong. The land does not need us to master it. It only asks that we remember we are made of the same dust, the same water, the same light. Maybe, if you are listening to this now, you can feel some of that truth echoing quietly inside you. The world may be loud, but silence still waits beneath it, patient as ever. And in that silence, if you listen long enough, you might just find yourself. The last years on the mountain were quieter than all the others combined. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. Silence had gone from being his companion, becoming his very breath. He no longer sought it. He lived within it. Each day began and ended the same way, not out of monotony, but out of rhythm. The mornings brought a pale light through the trees, the air sharp and thin, the world waking slowly beneath a skin of frost. He would sit outside with a tin cup of melted snow warmed over a small flame, watching steam drift into the air, and he would feel time passing not as loss as blessing. The days did not count down toward an ending, and they simply unfolded, each one complete in itself, each one enough. His hair had turned white long ago, blending with the snow that fell on his shoulders. His hands were lined, his body slower, but his eyes were still clear. The years had shaped him the way water shapes stone, wearing him down, yes, but polishing him too. There was no bitterness in his aging, no fear of what would come. He had seen too many cycles to believe that anything truly ends. The snow melts, the river runs, the frost returns. Life turns endlessly, never in circles but in spirals, always deeper, always returning home in a new way. He spoke little now, not out of choice, but because words seemed unnecessary. The world spoke through movement, through light, through the quiet pulse that lived in all. When the wind moved through the pines, he heard it like a prayer. When the ice cracked across the river, he heard laughter. Even the caw of ravens carried meaning, a kind of language needed no. He realized that silence had never been the absence. It had always been the presence of understanding. Sometimes he would think about the people who might still remember him, the ones who had once known his name, who had heard stories about the hermit in Alaska, who built his life from snow, and he wondered what they imagined. Perhaps they thought he had died long ago, frozen in some forgotten valley. Perhaps they romanticized his life, turning it into myth or warning. He smiled at the thought, because he knew that the truth was simple and far more beautiful. He had not disappeared. He had returned. He had gone so far into the wild that he had come out the other side of it, into a peace that most people never. Not because it's hidden, it's too simple. He still kept his small journal, though his entries had grown shorter, fewer. The words were like footprints on fresh snow, light, deliberate, never more than. Sometimes he wrote things like, "The silence feels warmer today," or "The wind smells like change." Each line was both observation and gratitude. He no longer needed to explain anything to himself. Life had become self-explanatory. There were nights when he would wake to the sound of the wolf again, or perhaps its descendants. The line continued through time. The howls echoed through the valley, long and deep, rising into the night like a memory calling home. He would listen, smiling in the dark, and feel that same quiet recognition he had felt years before. Life continues, he would think. The mountain remembers. Nothing is lost. One spring, after a particularly harsh winter, he felt his strength fade faster than usual. The climb to gather wood left him breathless. The snow seemed heavier, the wind colder. He understood what it meant. He was afraid. He began to prepare as he always had, not out of desperation, calm. He cleaned his shelter, stacked his tools neatly, left his journal where it could be found. He gathered enough firewood for one last winter, not because he thought he would need it, but because he liked the feeling of completeness. He cooked a final meal with care, savoring the taste of every bite. It wasn't sadness he felt, it was gratitude, deep and endless. On his final evening, he sat outside watching the sunset spill gold across the peaks. The sky burned with color, the snow reflecting it in soft hues that seemed to come from within. He thought about how strange and beautiful it was that something so cold could hold so much light. He thought about the world below, the people rushing through their days, and he hoped they might one day see that same light, not in the sky, but in themselves. The mountain had taught him that beauty does not live in places, it lives in person. He felt the cold slowly settle into his bones that night, not cruelly, but gently, like an old friend tucking him in. He lay down inside his shelter, the walls faintly glowing with moonlight through the snow. His breathing slowed, his thoughts became still. He was not leaving the world, he was becoming again. The air inside the shelter was warm, 40 degrees warmer than the frozen world outside, just as it had been that first winter. He smiled at the memory, that quiet proof of how life always protects itself in ways the mind cannot imagine. When morning came, the valley was silent. The fire had gone out, the snow untouched, the wind still. But if someone had walked through that place, if they had stepped into the shelter and felt the faint warmth that lingered there, they would have understood. The mountain had not taken him. It had. His breath had simply joined the cold air, body, soil, spirit, and if you listened closely, you might still hear him in the whisper of wind across the snow, in the slow creak of the trees, in the deep quiet that fills the space after storm. He had not disappeared. He had returned to where he had always belonged. Years later, travelers who ventured into that part of Alaska sometimes found traces, a smooth patched stone that looked shaped by hand, an old metal cup half buried in ice, faint carvings on the wood of a collapsed shelter. They would speak in low voices, a hermit who once lived there, who built a snow home that stayed 40 degrees warmer than the world outside, who survived decades alone. Some would shake their heads, wondering how anyone could live like that. Others would smile, quietly, as if they understood that maybe it wasn't loneliness that kept him there, but peace. And maybe one or two would stand in that silence a little longer than the rest, feeling something move inside them, a longing, a remembering, because that is his true legacy, not the shelter or the legend endurance, but the understanding he left. That silence is not empty. That solitude is not the absence. That peace does not come from escaping the world, but from belonging so fully to it that you no longer need to be. The mountain was never his prison. It was his reflection, and the warmth he found there, the warmth that kept him alive when the world said he would freeze, was not in the snow or the shelter. It was in the simple truth that when a man stops fighting life, life begins to hold him. If you ever find yourself lost, restless, or surrounded by noise too loud to hear your own heart, remember his story. Remember that there is still a place within you untouched by all of it, a quiet shelter of your own making, 40 degrees warmer than the coldest world. You don't have to go to the mountains to find it. You only have to stop running, sit still, listen. The silence will teach you everything. And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of what you've always known deep down, tell me where you're listening from. Leave your thoughts in the comment. Share it with someone who might need this kind of calm. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, because somewhere out there beyond the noise, the mountain still waits, breathing, patient, alive, and its silence calling.